It's time now for the political analysis of Fromm and Fuller. Al Fromm, former political advisor to President Bill Clinton, and Craig Fuller, former political advisor to both President Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Good morning, all. Al, there's going to be a lot of things talked about as we move toward a presidential election, including Joe Biden's age. And I did notice recently quite a bit of news coverage about concerns about Senator Dianne Feinstein's ability to stay in office. I believe she is 88 years old. I could be wrong on that. And we also found out in the last couple of weeks that Senator Grassley from Iowa will be running, and I think he might be completing his term if he is reelected at the age of 96. At what point do we pull the plug on some of these folks? What are your thoughts as a young man?
As a young man, well, since I'm now 78, I can proudly say that something I didn't expect to happen at 78, the five most important leaders, political leaders in this country are older than I am. Starting with the majority leader of the House, actually, our own Steny Hoyer, who's 82, Nancy Pelosi and Jim Clyburn, Nancy the Speaker, Clyburn the Whip. Pelosi's 82, Clyburn's 81. Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate, is 80. Joe Biden, the president, he's the young guy. He's only 79. So I guess he's got a bright future in front of him. It seems to me to be that we're to a point where we really need the next generation of leaders to begin to emerge. I must say I'm a little bit surprised that hasn't happened already. I honestly thought that when Barack Obama defeated Hillary Clinton, who was sort of the same generation that I am and we are, Craig's a little younger, I guess, that we had turned the corner and gone to a new generation. But then we went back, after Obama, we went back to Trump, who was at that point the oldest man ever elected president. And then in our party, the Democratic Party, we went back to Biden. I'm reminded, first of all, obviously, as you get older, your energy declines, you might have a very sharp mind, but you also are farther and farther out of touch with all the new stuff happening in the country. And I think it's really important for the president and the congressional leaders, particularly in a fast changing period like we're in, to be closely in touch with what's going on. So I do believe age is there's a point where you ought to just say, look, I've had my run. I just want to say with Biden, the first time I ever thought about him running for president was in 1983. That's a long time ago. And he won on his third try, and it wasn't like his tries were consecutively, because he ran in 88 and then in 2008 and then gets elected in 2020. I just want to close with this, because obviously the experience and knowledge that these leaders have is important. But when I was a young man and learning at Senator Ed Muskie's knee, he said there were three stages in a politician's life. The first was when they were young and had all these great ideas, didn't quite know how to get them enacted or really whether they were very good or not, but were always brimming with ideas. The second, when they're a little older, more mature, didn't have many new ideas of their own, but recognized good new ideas and were able to put them into action. And the third was when you get so old that you reject new ideas out of hand. And, I'm not going to make a judgment on all these leaders, but we really have had pretty stagnant government, pretty divisive government, as the fights of, more than one generation have just sort of continued. I think the country really needs a new generation of leaders.
To Craig, you were with the original old man in American politics. So things have even changed since Ronald Reagan's time. But what's your take on all this?
I think it's a real concern. And I actually, I pretty much fully associate myself with what Al just said. But the question actually causes me to think about it maybe from a little different direction. And it troubles me, but the fact of the matter is the people that you've identified are elected officials. And, we have a country in which the voter gets to decide which candidate among several usually is best suited to represent them. And so obviously in the Senate with a 6-year term, things can change, but with 2-year terms for members of Congress and 4-year terms for presidents, it's the voter that decides. And I think, like Al, that we were headed in a different direction for younger leadership, but that's because that's what the voters sought. And when they looked at their choices, they went for younger leaders. And recently that has not been the case. And I just, I guess I'm not willing to impose kind of my notion of what it takes to be an effective leader this day and age. It's extremely demanding. It calls for extraordinary judgment every single day. It calls for experiences really across the globe, in my judgment. But I get to cast my vote when the election comes, and my judgment may be not the same as other people. What I do believe, though, is that we have reached a point in time when the kind of physical examination ought to include some kind of cognitive review. I know something about this. I'm not an expert in it, but the fact is that I flew airplanes for 50 years. Every 2 years, I got a medical examination in order to, reaffirm that I was capable physically of flying an airplane. It never included a cognitive test. If I was to go out today, I stopped flying about 5 years ago. If I was to go out today, I could renew that medical, but I wouldn't take a cognitive test. And the cognitive exam, the value of it over time, after, let's say, you reach 65 or 70, whatever number you want to pick, it begins to inform an individual and those around him or her of just what's happening. And there are people who are quite effective well into their 80s or 90s. But there are others, and sadly, we just had a case of some very high profile person with Bruce Willis, an actor, but an actor who no longer can recall lines and had to step away from a career he loved. And I think there's actually some lessons there. I think people around him, went to him and said, it's time. And ultimately, I think that the voter has to decide, but for these older elected officials, they would be wise to have people around them that help them, understand their circumstance and gives them some advice. I had a dear friend who, he's still alive, but he was a CEO of a very demanding organization in Washington, D.C. And he took the job kind of knowing that it was really the last position of his career. But he had 4 or 5 of us, and he would always say, I am depending upon you to tell me if my time to leave has arrived. And he went all out for many years, and he did the job extremely effectively for many, many years. And really, of his own choosing, he found a successor and moved on in a very orderly way. But he was conscious of the fact that the cognitive abilities he needed to do the job, if they were to decline, he might not recognize it. And I thought that was pretty mature. And I think this notion that this ought to be part of a physical exam goes for CEOs as well as older elected officials. I just think we'd all be better off because of the intense requirements put on leaders these days.
Al, I guess I want to come back to you since I think the Democrats have a really challenging situation coming up. President Biden has made it clear he's going to run for re-election. There's going to be a lot of inspection of how he's functioning in that role. And going back to your statement, there is a feeling that there's a need for new leadership. What do you think the Democrats should do?
Well, first of all, I don't put much stock in announcements that you're going to run for reelection, you know, at the beginning of the first term. There's a lot that could happen between now and 2024. You know, age so I don't know whether Joe Biden will run or not. If I had to guess, to be honest with you, I'd say he's not going to run. That's just my guess. You know, age is going to be an issue. And one of the problems with age as an issue is once people judge you as old and too old, that's not going to change. You can't improve your ratings because you're just going to get older. I think the Democratic Party really needs a new generation of leaders. I hope they come from the States, to be honest with you. I mean, you know, one of the things that happens in the Congress is because of the seniority system, you wind up with people who are the oldest and longest serving, and usually the oldest, not always the oldest, but most of the time the longest serving are the oldest in the top positions. And what's happened on the Democratic side of the House is that I'm sure there are a lot of people, a lot of younger potential candidates and or even members who have sort of felt blocked out because there's no path to leadership. I mean, I think of Rahm Emanuel. Rahm Emanuel was on the path under ordinary circumstances when he, as campaign committee chairman, helped win the House in 2006 to be speaker. But there was not going to be any path. And so he left to go work for President Obama. You know, the country suffers when there isn't an opportunity for new leaders to arise. I suspect that whether Biden runs or not, particularly if his numbers don't improve, there will be challenges, I suspect, in you know, I'm not as familiar with the governors as I used to be, but I hope we get a couple of governors who think about running because one, being a governor is the best preparation for being president. And secondly, because governors aren't necessarily nationally known, they come into the national political arena as fresh faces, and I think we'd all benefit from that.
You have the last word.
I think one of the things to take note of is that we kind of do a lousy job for the most part with succession in politics. So many times a person who's speaker or majority leader, or they're not that keenly interested in anointing a successor because that individual becomes a threat. Whereas in business, it's a fundamental responsibility of leadership to have a succession plan that's developed and a board reviews candidates, internal, external, whatever. We just don't do that. I actually think, you mentioned Ronald Reagan, I actually think that the relationship between Ronald Reagan and George Bush over the 8 years of the Reagan presidency was a remarkable one. And the level of trust and respect between those two individuals was considerable. And President Reagan knew that he had somebody who could succeed him either after 8 years or in the interim should something happen. And I think he actually thought about that. If he didn't think about it in the very beginning when he named him as much, he certainly did over the course of his presidency. I think that's really quite you know, kind of a fundamental point that we need to pay more attention to succession. But again, it's something that's up to the voters. So I think that to answer your question quickly, I won't be asked, but if I was sitting around after the November elections over the holidays at the end of this year, and Joe Biden asked me, I'd say you probably have your hands full with Republican majorities, at least in one of the two houses, if not both. And you ought not to run again. You ought to recognize you've been an extraordinary leader in the country and have had an extraordinary record, and take the next 2 years to get some things done and open this up for others. But you know, we'll see what happens, I guess.
I have to leave it there. Al Fromm, Craig Fuller, thank you so much indeed. We'll see you next week.